Reid, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. I'm a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI as we are better known, and I run a project that works very closely with the ECPR called the Strategic Hub for Organised Crime Research, SHOC, and have the kind of great pleasure of working with Philia in particular, and various other people too. And for those who aren't familiar with RUSI, we are the UK's oldest defence and security think tank, established in 1831. Please don't be fooled by the word royal. We are fully independent of the government, and we are a UK charity as well. And the team that I belong to, and the reason why I'm here moderating this webinar today, is the Organised Crime and Policing team. And it's just a huge pleasure to be here with such a distinguished list of people, and I'm sure that we're all going to learn a lot today. There are over 120 people signed up for this event, and I have absolutely no doubt that that's because the attraction of this webinar lies in the distinguished lineup that we have with us today. So today we'll hear from Professor Liz David Barrett, who is the director of the very highly acclaimed Centre for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex, followed by Professor Alberto Vannucci of the University of Pisa, who has authored a huge 150 plus academic publications, mainly centred on this topic. So I look forward to hearing a synthesis of some of those findings. And then last, but definitely not least, a scholar known to us all, I think, as Professor J. Albanese of the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. And in this particular session, which is one of 3 events in this series, so I encourage you to take a look online at the other events that are available. We want to stick to the theory here and see to what extent we have the tools and the frameworks necessary to tackle a couple of overarching questions. And these are really, what are the most useful theoretical frameworks we have to explore the relationship between organised crime and corruption? Under what conditions does that relationship emerge, and how do those conditions shape the relationship itself? And then finally, what are the practical implications of our theoretical models? What can they tell us about the agents involved? And what are the kind of real world applications of that research? So without too much further ado, I will pass you over to Professor Liz David Barrett.
Thanks very much, Alex. So I usually say that my work is about relationships between the state and business, and particularly about the corruption risks that occur at that interface. So sometimes that's lobbying and the revolving door and corruption risks posed there. A lot of my work is about corruption in public procurement. So obviously that's also the state giving out contracts largely to businesses and to the private sector. And so when I was thinking about how organised crime and corruption interact, I thought, well, actually, this is just a subset in a way of state-business relations. Organised crime is a type of business, and so we can also look at it in terms of the different types of relationships that organised crime has with the state. And so I'm going to set out 3 different relationships here. So the first one is that the state is the law enforcer. The state has law enforcement agencies, the police and other agencies that try to prevent, detect and collect evidence about crime. And the state also punishes those who commit crimes. It tries them and punishes them. And so where the state is reasonably effective in doing that, then organised crime needs to try to corrupt those law enforcement agencies to prevent them from disrupting the illegal activity of the organised crime groups. So that's the kind of relationship that you see between organised crime and corruption in, for example, the TV series that half of Britain has been watching over the last few weeks, Line of Duty. In Line of Duty, organised crime groups, OCG, are trying to corrupt the police so that the police won't interfere with their ability to make money. They're also trying to corrupt judges so that they won't put them in prison. And corruption is what allows organised crime groups to act with impunity. But what I think is interesting there is that the state has got to be fairly functional as a law enforcement capacity for organised crime to be bothered about trying to corrupt it. So that's the first relationship, state as a law enforcer. The second relationship then is that the state is a resource for organised crime. So the state owns assets, the state collects tax and spends it. And so that creates an opportunity for organised crime groups to try to appropriate some of those funds. So this happens most readily in the privatisation of state assets, for example, something that organised crime groups want to get their hands on those assets. But that's typically quite a kind of discrete historical period in a state's organisation. So we see this, for example, at the beginning of transition, post-communist transition in Eastern Europe, particularly see it in Russia with oligarchs managing to capture resources in the privatisation process, but also in the Balkans, where I was working and doing my PhD in the late 90s. That was very much the story. Once you've got through that privatisation process as a kind of historical process or period, then public procurement is the main place where this can happen. So the state is buying goods and services all the time. It's commissioning the building of public works and infrastructure. And so organised crime groups have a major interest in capturing those assets and those flows of money. Essentially, historically, this is the equivalent of a highwayman like Dick Turpin holding up a horse and cart that has just collected taxes from the people. But in modern states, we have rules around how you allocate state funds and how you award contracts. And that means that organised crime groups need to work quite hard to corrupt the public officials who control the access to those funds, the people who are in charge of the public procurement process and giving out the money, or in charge of the privatisation process. So they need to make deals with the people who are running the tenders on the government side so that they'll then channel the contracts towards the organised crime groups. And they also need deals so that the public officials will overlook the fact that the winners of the contracts are not actually building that road that they were supposed to build, not actually providing the medicines that they were supposed to supply, or maybe they're supplying them, but they're supplying them at hugely inflated prices that is basically robbing the state. So that second one is around the state as a resource. And then the third relationship is the state as a rule maker. So states create rules that shape markets and business opportunities. Sometimes it's because of those rules that they actually create markets for illicit goods. So it's because we ban drugs that criminal groups emerge to meet the demand for drugs. But organised crime groups might also want to completely capture that rule-making function of the state so that they can shape the rules in ways that benefit themselves, to exclude their competitors from the market, for example. And so for that, they need to corrupt the highest holders of public office, those who are making the rules. Now, in theory, in democracies, those who are making the rules are legislators. But in practice, that depends quite a lot on how power is distributed in political systems. Corrupting a couple of hundred legislators in a parliament is actually quite hard work. But if the executive branch is very strong compared to the legislature, then actually it's probably going to be much more efficient to just corrupt a political party that you think will get into government. And that party then sets the legislative agenda, makes decisions about how to allocate budget resources. And in many parliaments, many countries, the parliament is pretty weak and doesn't really have much capacity to challenge that. If you can rely on a party that gets into power to do that, then if you're an organised crime group, you've got a big incentive not just to help them get into power, but also to help them stay there once they're in power. And so a whole lot of organised crime activity is also around this kind of, what we as political scientists call state capture. So organised crime groups have an interest in funding political parties. Once in power, the political parties shape the laws and distribute the resources towards the organised crime groups, and that's classic machine politics. Again, something that we've seen throughout history all around the world, definitely something that we've seen in countries that we now regard as quite mature democracies. So you've got that kind of machine politics going on, and because it's working as a machine, what you also get is that the organised crime group is providing governance services to an extent. So it's competing with the state, but it has an interest in squashing any sources of opposition or competition. And so going back to the question around theories, I think, when we're looking at theories of corruption, what we've got largely is a set of theories about how you control corruption. So we've got theories about principal agent models. How do you get the principal to be able to better control the agent? We've got theories about systemic corruption being a collective action problem. But I think in a way what we need to think about the relationships between organised crime and corruption are really actually just going back to basics of political economy analysis. What we need to think about is who holds the power, how is it distributed? So is it distributed quite widely, in which case you've essentially got a kind of checks and balances situation, competition for resources, or is it distributed in a way that's really concentrated? So you've actually got just a few key individuals who are controlling all of the power, a classic kind of oligarchic situation. Are the institutions that are then built in a way that are extractive and really about getting as much out of the state as possible, or are they inclusive and helping to distribute power more broadly and build those things up? So I think, what you see here is that I would suggest that what we need to think about organised crime and corruption relationships is actually to use that structure that we have in political science around state capture and to look at what's happening in state capture. And what we see there actually is that whereas we used to see that as a few business interests or maybe organised crime interests capturing the state, it's actually increasingly led by politicians, and they're then able to use their power to clamp down on the whole accountability ecosystem, cement themselves in power, and cut off the sources of opposition. So I'll leave it there for now, but look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Liz. That was incredibly interesting, and I'm sure that's going to stimulate a lot of dialogue between panelists as well. So Alberto, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Alexandra. I am a political scientist, and my main research interest has been corruption, and I'm lucky enough to be Italian, so there is a lot of material to rely on in my research. But in Italy, when you look for corruption, sooner or later you find organized crime on your way. I find it quite early when I started to study corruption in certain areas of Italy, Sicily, for instance. In every book that I wrote on corruption, there is always a chapter focusing on the relationship between mafia type organized crime and corruption. And I saw strange things going on in these interactions between criminal groups, mafia-like criminal groups, politicians, public servants, entrepreneurs. For instance, mafia groups that collected bribes from companies even before they had won any public tender, just because some funded funds had been allocated to a certain project. Or in other cases, mafia groups who apparently played no role in a certain context, but they collected a fixed percentage of the value of a public contract paid by companies and distributed the bribe money to politicians, bureaucrats, with a fixed percentage, 5% in Sicily during the 90s of the past century, 3% to politicians, and 2% to the mafia family, with an additional 0.8% of the value of the contract to the central body of Cosa Nostra, the so-called commission. There are also, we have observed also the opposite case of politicians who apparently paid bribes to mafiosi, who managed somehow to collect and to address towards them electoral support. So there is an interesting research question here. There are different resources at stake. in this kind of corporate exchange, and presumably different roles played by the same actors in different contexts. Among them, there are criminal organizations. They are clearly empirically interconnected, corruption and organized crime. So my effort was to distinguish between them in analytical terms. So to be able to recognize and to understand their relationship. As a full disclosure, my theoretical framework was a neo-institutional one. So let's start with corruption. There are hundreds of definitions of corruption, but a common ground of almost all of them is the idea that something is going wrong in the exercise of entrusted power. There is corruption when somebody abuses a power delegated to him by someone else for a private, personal advantage. A typical case is when there is a third party who bribes him. So corruption, broadly defined, is a betrayal of trust that can be observed both in the public and in the private sector, in markets, in the state, in any organizational context. But corruption can develop, flourish, become systemic without any significant connection with organized crime. And that's the case in Italy, probably the largest corruption scandal in the history of modern democracies. The so-called clean hands, mani pulite scandal during the 90s of the last century, when we observed that corruption had become systemic. Every company had to pay a fixed percentage to access to public contracts, but no significant role was played by criminal groups. And also, on the other side, we have had many cases in which criminal organizations in Italy, at least, have operated effectively in illegal markets without any significant interaction with the public decision makers. But there is a fatal attraction between corruption, which means actors involved in corruption, and organized crime. And when they meet and somehow overlap their activities, they tend to establish a symbiotic nexus that makes both of them stronger. And being very schematic, I consider three general models of interaction between corruption and organized crime. The first one is the most straightforward. Organized crime is a cause of corruption. Leeds, Professor Daniel Barrett described it very well. Criminal groups act in this case like any other briber, which means that they use money or other material incentives to get the preferential treatment in public decisions, which may involve the law enforcement role, so to obtain impunity. It can involve the state as a resource, I'm quoting Leeds, in order to win tenders and so on, or to capture the lawmaking process, or basically to obtain a competitive advantage against other criminal groups. That's another strategy that can be pursued through corruption. So in this case, the strategy of corruption and collusion with their counterpart in the public administration and in politics, when possible, can be more effective for a criminal group than the alternative strategy of violence, since it doesn't create social alarm and the counter-reaction of the state, since corruption, when successful, is hidden by definition, while violence, to be effective, often requires to be visible. So a criminal organization can bribe like anybody else, but it is a very peculiar briber. It is much less likely than that its partner in the corrupt exchange, knowing its identity, will cheat or will denounce. In other words, when a criminal group enters in corrupt exchanges, simply by being there, it creates incentives towards discipline among all participants in the corruption arena, so to say. And here we go into the second potential overlapping between corruption and organized crime, when the criminal organization does not demand, but it supplies something, a resource, a fundamental resource, protection. It can provide enforcement to actors who are involved in corruption. And this is especially the case when a mafia-like organization is involved, which means a criminal organization oriented not only towards profit, as any criminal organization typically do, but also towards power, having the capability and the authority, see the Gambetta approach, to provide protection in a certain territory and market, more often illegal market, like as the market of corruption is. In this case, the criminal group, especially when it's a mafia-like criminal group, provide extra legal governance in the network of corrupt exchanges, reducing uncertainty in the interaction among actors involved in it. And then we are into the third and last potential overlapping, which is similar to a fusion. Corruption can become here a generator of organized crime. We have here some sort of organizational isomorphism. In this case, we observe corruption networks where white-collar actors adopt mafia-like governance strategies. It's the case of organized corruption, we may call it. What we observe here is an endogenous criminal organization which is created within a pre-existing network of public and private agents involved in corruption. In this case, there is a structure of authority which emerges in the network, having the capability to exercise a hierarchical coordination and the power to allocate roles and resources and the capability to enforce the fulfillment of informal norms and corrupt exchanges. In Italy, organized corruption has been observed having different figures as guarantors, capable to inflict sanctions in case of defection, like organized crime typically can do, but without violence. Among them, private companies, middlemen, high-ranking bureaucrats, and political parties. That's the case of clean hands, Mani Pulite, what we observed in that scenario. To conclude, in Italy, it is commonly said that organized crime and corruption, mafia and corruption, are two sides of the same coin. In my perspective, in my approach, this is an optimistic view. It's not so simple. Unfortunately, in the world of corruption, there are a lot of different coins, and each coin can have different actors, different faces, the faces of different actors playing different roles. And among them also criminal actors. That's all for me. I hope I was in my timeline.
You are perfectly on time, I'm pleased to say. Can I pass over now to Professor Jay Albanese as well? And then after that, we can kick off the Q&A. Please do paste any comments or questions into the chat. And otherwise, just let me know if you would like to ask a question in person after Jay has finished speaking. Go ahead, Jay.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for hosting this event. Alberto and Liz are difficult acts to follow, so I will show some pictures. As we talked about earlier in setting all this up, Philia said my maximum was, if I'm going to do slides, 5 slides. So I know you're dying to see my 5 slides. So let's try this here. Hopefully you can see that. Also, this slide, by the way, does not count in my 5. Just a first remark by way of preface. I think what we are talking about right now is the most important topic on the entire planet. And this slide summarizes why. There's a lot of groups, the UN and all these other groups, that rank what are the largest problems in the world, so we can direct limited resources at the most important problems. And these shift a little bit over time, but the slide pretty much, summarizes these, what are considered to be, the most important problems, and you know what they all are. But when you look at all those problems, air pollution, poverty, every one of these problems is either man-made, unfortunately, mostly by men, or pushed to a crisis point by the decisions of humans. So the question is, for me, can it be said that every single one of the largest problems in the world, as shown on the top of this slide, exists due to choices and decisions that were made worse by corruption and organized crime? And I would argue in every single case here, all of these problems were pushed to crisis point by not only bad decisions, but decisions influenced by corruption. Anyway, that's enough of that. Here, let's look at a slide. Now that we've established that we're talking about a topic that we should be spending some time discussing. Okay, this slide depicts an actual case. And the case here occurred in 2019. We had a US company, oil and gas company, looking for contracts in Iraq and Brazil. All right, so what they did, they paid bribes to 7 government officials in Iraq, but they did it via Monaco. They had a consultant in Monaco who basically got the money through a third-party account, through an intermediate, basically a shell company, who then used it to influence government officials in Iraq. They were also interested in doing business in Brazil. Here, they made payments through a company, a consultant in Singapore, who then bribed the officials in Brazil. And of course, these middle people in Monaco and Singapore, in this case, were there to hide the source of the money. Right? They were hide, so it wasn't a direct bribe. This ultimately began as a money laundering case because the company's in Texas. It went through a New York bank, and there were a lot of intermediaries. It resulted in a very large, almost $300 million global settlement dealing with corruption and money laundering. But what we have here is bribery in both the private and the public sectors. But what I'm pointing to is the role of the facilitators in all of this. Let me move my slide here. Here we go. So as you can see here on the bottom of the slide, the text here. All right, so money was transferred from Texas to New York to Monaco through an intermediary company. And these are quotes taken from the formal charging documents in the case. And you can see the sole purpose of this middle person and consultants in Monaco and Singapore, the sole purpose was in fact to facilitate bribe payments through the connections they had and their willingness to do this. So their intermediaries only had one purpose, and the purpose was to facilitate the payment of bribes, making contacts with the appropriate people and engaging in an international bribery scheme. So the question is this public corruption? Is it private corruption? Is it organized crime? And I'm arguing, of course, that it is in fact all three, and that organized crime and corruption are much more similar than different. Using an enterprise model, these facilitators in the previous slide, in Monaco and Singapore in this case, they were there to survive and make a profit. They're there to make money on this money laundering scheme where they were moving real money and getting it from the major corporation in the US to the customer, who the company that they wanted to do business with. Well, how do you in fact, do that. And so it's movement. In this case, the money movers were in fact individuals solely there to do an illicit act. There was nothing legitimate about what they were doing. We tend to think about organized crime enterprises in terms of moving illicit goods and services, which many of them do. You know, whether it's drugs from supply to customers, whether it's counterfeit products, you know, from Asia to Europe, whatever it might be. Here, it was getting corporate money, laundering it, and getting it to people to influence decisions involving actually public procurement on the part of Brazil and Iraq in this case. So when you look at these things, they have pressures. So whether you're an organized crime group trafficking in drugs, or whether you're one of these quote unquote consultants, in this case in Monaco or Singapore, you're doing the same thing. You're moving illicit goods, or in here, illicit money. You have to worry about regulators. I mean, you have to be able to get your way into this little marketplace. You worry about enforcement. You worry about people in the government that you can, in fact, corrupt. And at the same time, you worry about competition, right? You have to make money. Are there alternative people or groups they can contact, whether they're monies people or whether they're drug suppliers, right? The considerations I'm arguing are the same entrepreneurial considerations, whether you're moving money for a multinational criminal enterprise or whether you're doing it to traffic drugs from one part of the world to the other, or counterfeit products, or anything else. That is always about the money. Another way to look at the same thing, whether you're an organized crime group, you're always moving something, usually illicit goods and services, from one place to another. In the case I gave you, again, we can tend to consider that, well, that's multinational corporate corruption. And of course it is, but without the use of the facilitators, that is the criminal facilitators, in this case, the quote unquote consultants, which is a nice way, in some other contexts, we'd say, well, this is an organized crime figure who knows how to move money on untraceable funds and knows who to bribe to get people to make corrupt decisions. So there's always a supply. You have to move it. In this case, you're moving money, but it could be drugs, it could be people, it could be anything else. You have to get people on the destination end to accept it. You have to launder it. And then, of course, you have to survive. So you have to protect yourself as an illicit actor to make sure that you are, in fact, can stay in business. So this is what corruption does for you. So to summarize, what I'm getting at here is this, my last slide. That is, whether it's organized crime or corruption, it's usually about the money. I would argue it's almost always about the money. Freezing and confiscation of assets, to me, is really an untapped resource globally in terms of showing people when governments are trying to make an effort to separate offenders from the profits of their crimes. So my takeaway is that organized crime, white-collar crime, corruption, all have the same objective, but we too often portray organized crime as the predator that victimizes the public and private sectors, when in many cases it's just the opposite. That is, public officials use organized crime as a tool in deceiving and defrauding the public. So the exploitation often begins with corruption rather than organized crime. So it's easy to blame, the bad guys of organized crime for problems rather than looking carefully at the good guys in the legitimate business and government sectors who are actually doing illicit things in their official capacities. So let me leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jay. And I think there was one kind of common theme across all three presentations, which was the need to draw more attention to the way in which politicians seek to reflect or maybe even openly solicit the interests of organised crime rather than the other way around, which is how we tend to assume the kind of relationship goes. Liz, you sort of mentioned that first in your talk. I was wondering, are there, in your mind, commonalities across the specific kind of countries or systems where this happens? Do you have some examples from your work that demonstrates that relationship in action?
So, I mean, I think what I would say is that it's interesting to look at the level of development of the state and these things around how dispersed power is in the state. And it seems to me that where you've got quite concentrated power, then that's a classic situation where you've easily got an interaction between the politicians and the organised crime groups. And in a sense, what we expect to happen in development is that you get, so you know, essentially we've all come from societies where there's feudalism and there's basically a few people competing with power, and they're competing with violence for power. Yeah, so in England, it's around you know, nobles are essentially start off as warlords who have basically got the best armies, and they're able to take bits of territory, and gradually you get down to, you know, fewer and fewer warlords and domination over a certain territory. So I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about really with organised crime groups, I think. And if you look at transition Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union, you've got pretty much same dynamics. You've got this particular event that happens with transition where suddenly a lot of state resources are freed up and distributed, and so that's up for capture by a few groups and a few oligarchs. And we saw that particularly in Russia. And what we hoped would happen is that those oligarchs would, you know, the power would be distributed enough that you would get oligarchs actually having an interest in rule of law and in investing in state and building state capacity and building the capacity of a state to be able to protect their own resources. So we kind of hope that's our kind of hopeful development model. And I think what has instead happened, and it's partly a result of the globalization of the economy, is that you've got people being able to triage different regulatory systems and step outside that. So, you know, we see at the moment, and Oliver Bullough writes about this a lot, how in fact those oligarchs will come and use UK courts to do their arbitration of their own dispute resolution. And so in a sense, you don't need them to invest in building up the state in their own state, because they can just sort of go elsewhere and get that, and much more convenient then to keep this extractive relationship with your own state, but use the rule of law resources from other states. So I think, you know, that's what in a way has complicated this relationship, and why you don't see that kind of development path where you would get, you know, dispersion of power, which gradually leads to an investment in building up the state. I'm not sure if that's answered your question.
No, it definitely has. And it made me think about that kind of principle of exceptionalism that we often have in what we call the sort of developed world, although it's obviously a very poor term. But there was a really interesting public art exhibition in the UK recently, which had big billboards that said cronyism is English for corruption. This idea that we don't like to talk about corruption in our society. We assume that it happens elsewhere. And I wondered, Alberto, have you seen this topic develop beyond Italy? Italy is always the kind of case study extraordinaire for discussing these themes. Are there other countries? Do you see the research agenda becoming more democratized to look at other systems?
I focus mainly on Italy, but it's an interesting starting point to enlarge the perspective to other countries which have similar conditions. For instance, I would like to add something to what Liz said. The relationship between the characteristic of the state, the degree of concentration of power, which is more diffused in a well-functioning democracy, and is more concentrated when the regime becomes more authoritarian. Well, I agree with Liz, but only when we consider a certain type of relationship between organized crime and corruption. In the case of the specific mafia-like type of organized crime that we observe in Italy, I think that there can be a significant difference. I would like to quote a very famous Italian writer, Salvatore Sciascia, who was once asked why, how could be explained that the fascist regime, that is a very authoritarian and with a much concentrated political power regime, fought very effectively Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia. It was very successful in probably one of the most successful phase of the Italian state against the Cosa Nostra was fought by the fascist regime, where the concentration of power was at the maximum level, and it was a non-democratic and authoritarian power. What's the reason? Well, the explanation of Salvatore Sciascia is fantastic. Well, obviously, the fascist regime fought against mafia. The fascist regime was a big mafia that had to affirm its power against the small mafia, the Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia. And so the power of the, so when you have a mafia-like organized crime, oriented also towards the exercise of an authority within a certain area, within a certain territory, well, the relations can be very different. I remember the case of a mafioso who once said that mafiosi Cosa Nostra prefer democracy, because in democracy there is a lot of confusion among different parties, competing politicians, and so mafiosi can enter into play, regulating that kind of interactions among different political parties. So I think it's when you add some new elements in this scenario, for instance, the presence of a specific kind of criminal organization like Cosa Nostra, like 'Ndrangheta, like Camorra, and that could be very interesting to enlarge our perspective to our context, where Yakuza in Japan, triads in China, or some kind of cartels in Latin America can play a similar role of interaction with a certain level of political power. And in that case, the challenge to democracy, I fear, is even stronger than in the case of ordinary organized crime, so to say.
That's fascinating. And I think this sort of discussion about democracies is incredibly relevant as we kind of look at different systems around the world and some of the disillusionment with that model abroad, not the kind of democracy promotion that we've seen in years past. Jay, I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege and just ask you a question, and then please everyone do say in the chat if you would like to ask a question. But your presentation was very close to my heart, as I'm ultimately a scholar of organized environmental crime. And I wondered, given the kind of corporate links there, to what extent is it useful to use the sort of terminology of organized crime? Does it actually obscure more than it reveals in a way? Oh, you may be on mute.
Thank you. I'm always at my best when I'm muted. You know, I think that the interesting thing is there, you know, that we, in every country around the world, we blame organized crime for many problems. And in many places that blame is well deserved. But we tend to look at public corruption and private corruption as, you know, white collar crimes. They are treated differently. The penalty structures are different. There's no such thing as a deferred prosecution agreement with an organized crime group, but we do it all the time with corporations. So for me, it is useful, if at the very least, to educate the public. We tend to think organized crime is the other, and white collar crime and corruption are, you know, people who make bad decisions. Where, to me, the educational component is, I don't know of anybody who's been corrupt once, right? There's nobody involved in organized crime who's been involved once, all right? These are ongoing enterprises. These are ongoing criminal enterprises to violate the law. So to me, emphasizing their similarities as opposed to their differences, to me, is trying to get the public and ultimately legislators on board and realize these are manifestations of a very similar problem of people motivated to make money in illicit ways. And by doing that, they're defrauding the public and so forth. But I think getting that concept shifted in the minds of more people might lead to more effective targeting of public and private corruption as a problem. Whereas in fact, I find too many people in the public and private sector want to talk about organized crime, but never want to talk about the fact, well, hey, the facilitators you used in this case, these are organized crime people. We might not call them that. They're intermediary companies or they're consultants. But no, they are professional money launderers and connectors of powerful people in one country to another. So to me, the point would be to shift the frame of reference. So people see them as really manifestations are really the same phenomenon, just on to the different points on the entrepreneurial scale, in my view.
Brilliant. And Chiara, you posted in the chat. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. So I would actually have a follow-up question, which is strictly connected to what you, Alex, have just asked to Jay, and I would like to ask it also to Alberto. So my question is, especially with regards to specific sectors where we find organized crime groups operating, and these sectors are recognized as evolving threats, such as environmental organized crimes. We see that corruption is acknowledged as being an essential link of it, but at the same time, we really struggle in identifying whether it is white collar or organized crime, when, as Alberto fairly pointed out, as a matter of fact, white collar criminals tend then to adopt a mafia-like structure. So my question would be, how would you cross the line between white collar and organized crime group, or on the contrary, would you at all make such a distinction? Should we, on the contrary, consider evolving and bringing forward the definition of organized crime group as potentially being white collar crime?
Alberto, do you want to jump in?
Yes,
Thank you.
I was muted, sorry. Well, a very interesting question. Well, I would say that we can consider how organized crime, actors involved in different type of organized crime can have a different background. Some can be from that's the metaphor that was used in a very famous Italian case, the so-called middle world, the case of Mafia Capital, a case that occurred in Rome. Well, the metaphor is the middle world, a world where the upper world of white collars encounter the underworld of criminals, and they make business, basically. So there is this variability in the composition of criminal groups. And it's difficult, I admit, to recognize precisely which role is placed by each actor in each criminal business. Because it is variable. It changes according to opportunities, interest, and environmental crime is a fantastic sector, since huge profits can be collected simply. There was an inquiry in Tuscany just a couple of weeks ago, where through corruption, the illicit waste disposal of toxic wastes in the ground, connected with corruption in public procurement, because it was used as a material to build a public road. So the interconnection of different illegal criminal activities involving companies connected to 'ndrangheta, so to mafia-like criminal group, and politicians who get some financial support for their electoral campaigns. And so many actors, and it's just a small example. In Italy, we had, I think, the most dramatic case of environmental crime committed in an area of Campania, the so-called Heart of Fire. Unfortunately, that's not the name of a musical group. Heart of Fires. Since the toxic wastes were given to flame in order to burn them, with a dramatic impact on the health of the population. So I think that we have to try to understand in each case which is the composition, but I agree with Jay. In many cases, the bad guy, or at least the worst guy, is not the criminal one. It's the criminal guy often is a disposal, it's a service for the white collars. And so you have to distinguish between different cases. It's quite simple.
I think we are increasingly seeing that in the policy world as well. So you've seen the EU, they've gone from a cocaine monitoring routes program to a global illicit flows program that's trying to focus on all of the different enablers and kind of key nodes across different types of illicit flows. So I think it's really interesting to see that there is definitely some kind of feedback making its way into the way in which we view these crimes and kind of try to tackle them. We have a question here about the Irish parliamentary, which I think speaks to the levels of analysis and the kind of difficulty of building theories across the domestic and international level. Liz, your work has been very international. Is it quite tricky to kind of build a global theory from such a diverse number of case studies? Do you think it can be done?
I think it's quite difficult to build a global theory, yeah, but I mean, what I found interesting about the question, so I don't know if everybody can see it, but the question is essentially, in the case of Northern Irish terror organisations, both Republicans and Loyalists, they became adept at self-funding through crime when authorities strangled their financial networks. Have they moved into corruption, essentially? And I think that's a really interesting question. I think that, you know, I don't have evidence about that in particular, but I think that's the kind of displacement effect that I would expect to see, that, you know, corruption is essentially another source of resources and access to resources. And what I think is particularly interesting about the relationship between terrorism and politics and corrupt networks there is how that threat of violence really you know, distorts politics. So you know, it means that political actors have, you know, much less option in terms of how they're handling these particular players because of the threat of violence and trying to keep that and suppress that all the time. And it does worry me actually that, you know, with the violence that we've seen in Northern Ireland in recent few months, that there is a sense, I think, that the politicians are quite, you know, in hoc to terrorist groups because of that threat of violence all the time, and hence they're trying to make policy decisions in ways where, you know, they're having to bear that in mind. So I think that's a really interesting part of the picture, and relates perhaps also to Alberto's comments earlier around the fascists in Italy. So, you know, one thing that strikes me there is that they were quite willing to use a lot of violence to clamp down on the other mafia group, as it were. And one of the things that we often don't have in democracies where power is more dispersed is a willingness to use violence in the same way. So in a sense, democratic states are a little bit more you know, hamstrung in what they can do if they're in a situation where they're competing with these other groups, and you see that, I think, with the relationship between terrorist groups and the state.
Absolutely. And I'm going to call on Martin, who's got a question for Jay. I'm just going to ask you to unmute yourself, Martin. Go ahead.
Hello, Professor Albanese. This is a question for you. It's an honor to meet you. And my question is regarding the introduction of a national strategy against organized crime and corruption. Do you think that states require for a centralized office to to be in charge of these policies that you recommend or suggest? Or is it possible to introduce these measures through different agencies without any problems?
All right, very, very good question. The short answer is yes, and I have empirical support for that. That is, it's very important for national efforts against corruption, especially, and also organized crime, to be centralized in some way. That is because people at the local level, everybody knows each other, and there's very few, in fact, cases being made. A study we did in the US, right, a developed country, we looked at all the public corruption cases that were prosecuted over the last 30 years. And shockingly enough, 94% of all the prosecutions for public corruption in the US were made by the federal government at the top level. Only 6% were made by state governments. All right. So what we find is that prosecutions just don't generally occur at the local level. Maybe because it's easy to reach people, or co-opt people, or bribe them, or threaten them. I don't know why. But it seems like you need some distance and, of course, resources. So I would argue, you know, and just using the data I have from the US, that if it wasn't for public corruption cases being handled overwhelmingly by the federal government, we would have 90% fewer cases than have been made. So I think it's very important, yes.
And Alberto, do you think that holds true in Italy in the same system? Ooh, you're now on.
Okay, I was muted. Yes, in Italy we have something like that, or at least we are trying to institute something like that. So a centralized approach means that you can get information from different sources and confront them, compare them, and to have a deeper level of analysis. And in Italy, we are trying to address the action of the anti-mafia, so the authority invested of the power to fight against organized crime, of mafia-type organized crime, also to focus on corruption, on political corruption. And there was also a proposal, a law proposal, to introduce corruption as one of the distinguishing features for mafia-like organized crime, which is an article of our criminal code, just a proposal. So this is a recognition that this interconnection between the practice, the strategy of corruption, and the activity and the impact of organized crime, of mafia-like organized crime in Italy, is so important that it needs to be fought at, with a stronger coordination among the different public authorities who are invested of this role.
And just to all three speakers, is there a kind of other side to that coin, however, that when you have such a centralized response, you're obviously potentially creating a sort of single point of failure, or an area that can be quite opaque? Certain agencies who respond to corruption and organized crime can be very reticent to share information because they believe that other agencies are kind of their enemy. I don't know, Liz, if you've seen that in any of the case studies you've worked on.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is clear is that it's really important that agencies coordinate their activities and share information and intelligence. So, you know, certainly something that I've seen in work in the Caribbean, that, you know, that those relationships, and often quite informal relationships actually between agencies, are really important to success. So yeah, I can see your point around there being a risk of a central agency, but I think probably the more common problem is around fragmentation and fights over turf, really, between agencies, and not really you know, coordinating among their activities well enough. So I think you really need that coordination if possible. And you know, one of the problems in the UK has been just a lot of flux in the agencies that are going after organised crime. So we had the Serious Organised Crime Agency not very long ago, a bit more than a decade ago. We've had quite a lot of uncertainty around what was happening with the National Crime Agency. We've had the Serious Fraud Office and many on many occasions talk about abolishing the Serious Fraud Office. We've abolished the unit in the City of London Police that used to do international corruption. So I think there's just been a lot of flux in law enforcement, and that's really not helpful, partly because you lose good people and you lose institutional capacity, you create uncertainty. And so, I think whether it's sort of one organisation or many, you do need consistent resourcing and stability and coordination to make it work.
I'm going to call on Karina as well, who's put a great question into the chat. So Karina, if you want to unmute yourself. We can hear you.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much, the three of you, for your amazing presentations. I'm just going to read the question. So for the three of you, do you think that there is less support in terms of funding to explore the in-depth corruption and organized crime in Europe and in the United States? And I ask this question because my research topic is organized crime in Mexico. So I usually find that when it comes to focus on the so-called global South, Colombia, Mexico, South America, Middle East, Africa, there's a lot of support and money for that research when it comes to bring to the fore the enemy or the others. But when it comes to do more research in terms of money laundering or organized crimes or corruption in Europe and the United States, I personally have found that it's less support. And so I just wanted to ask you if you consider that this could be also considered some sort of academic corruption as well. And if in your experience you have found that there is less support and financial support to do your research. Thank you.
Jay, you're on national.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't know if we decided whether or not we were going to answer difficult questions. That is a difficult question, but the answer is, for example, if you are a early career researcher saying, what should I be focusing on to get promoted and the job of my dreams and all that, it is more difficult, clearly, in the US to get money to study corruption than it is to get money to study juvenile delinquency and other traditional kinds of crimes. It has historically been less of a priority. And there might be many reasons for that, but the money we apply for is, of course, government money. And the government agencies are the ones who set the priority targets for what's going to be funded and what isn't. So yes, it is more difficult. There has been progress been made in private sector corruption in recent years to fund, white collar crime kinds of studies of business corruption, but not so much in terms of studying public corruption. Money's just not there.
Liz, do you want to come in on that? Have you found it easy to kind of attract funding and do research on the UK or the US or kind of European countries?
So I think UK research funding has tended to see corruption as more of an international problem and more of a developing country problem in general. That's changed a little bit, I think, in the last 5-10 years. So in particular, the Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme funded by what was the UK Department for International Development, it has really, although it's the Department for International Development, been very willing to accept that there is a developed country role in a lot of global corruption. So I think that's slightly shifted. But in the UK domestically, there is, I think, definitely a denial about corruption being a problem at all. and that does influence both how much money there is for research and how much policy attention there is to the issue.
Alberto?
Okay, I can enter in the discussion with a full disclosure clause. I've been involved as a researcher in a huge European project on corruption and anti-corruption, the Anti-Corp project, a 5-year framework program, 7th. So it depends. I think that research funding follows certain trends and the perception of the relevance of certain problems, of certain issues. And corruption probably has become an issue as also at a European level. In Italy, for instance, we have no problem of funding for this kind of research lines. Again, another full disclosure, I'm principal investigator of a nationally funded, big funding on a project on depolitization of corruption and anti-corruption with 4 universities involved, financed by our Ministry of for the University. And I didn't, there is no academic corruption. I swear I didn't bribe the decision makers. That's not the case to get the funding. So it depends. I think that working in this field and as the public perception of the relevance, also not only in certain countries, Italy, for instance, but at European level of this kind of problems of corruption, of organized crime, even the capability of those who decide of this, the allocation of funds for research at academic and not only at academic level will increase their attention towards these kind of research projects.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about kind of perception and trends in academia in the UK. Liz mentioned Line of Duty, which is a big show that lots of people love here. We had McMafia, the book, and suddenly the UK government was obsessed with economic crime. We had huge policy movements. So these things really do move the needle and kind of draw attention to things that we consider to be very academic, but suddenly become quite glitzy. Separate to that, so David has asked a great question about the role of trust and social closeness between actors in organised crime groups and corruption. Liz, I'll come first to you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've been pondering that. I've seen it in the chat there, and I've been trying to think about how I would approach it. So, I mean, I guess broadly speaking, there's a big need for trust in these relationships because you're doing something that is illicit. So anyone could expose you. I don't really see a difference between that for organised crime and corruption. I guess with perhaps with the corrupt actors, there is more of a sense that they are violating norms associated with their office. So they're not just kind of doing something illegal, but they're also doing something in which they're sort of in a situation where there are lots of people who are hopefully the good people who are potential whistleblowers and potentially able to see what they're doing and collect evidence. So I guess on that, I might argue that corruption in a way is a risky transaction and you might need trust more. Whereas between the organised crime actors, yes, you need to trust each other for the business transaction, that you're going to, hand over the drugs and get the money and that kind of thing. But you can use violence to enforce that. Maybe in the corruption situation, it's a little bit more risky, a bit more chance of whistleblowers revealing what you're doing, perhaps a bit less propensity to use violence. So yeah, I'm making this up on the hoof, but my sense is that I might want to argue that you need trust more for corruption.
Does that ring true for you, Jay or Alberto?
I would say that you need different type of trust in corruption and in organized crime interactions. In the sense that in organized crime, usually there is a recognizable structure of authority. So you need the trust, at least within the organization, within the criminal group. You need to trust those above, that the boss, typically, that the rules, the activities, the roles, the exchanges within the organization and with other criminal groups will be, pacts will be fulfilled. Everything runs smoothly. While in corruption, there is not always this kind of hierarchical structure of trust. You sometimes have different types of trust which emerge also spontaneously in the interaction among actors involved. You have, in the case of corrupt exchanges, the problem of trust often requires simply the involvement in the network of actors involved of people who can be trusted. For instance, Jay mentioned before the important role of middlemen. In Italy, we have a specific word to define them, which is wonderful, faccendiere, which means some kind of enabler. Well, the role of these actors is precisely to, operate as professionals for trust giving. The corruptor and the corruptee, they don't need to trust each other. Since they both trust the middleman, the enabler, and that's enough. So also in this case, the solution is the professional, the role of a professionist for trust, so to say. So there are different solutions to this problem of trust that in the case of corruption more often is an horizontal solution. So there is a need to create some kind of social capital linking together people who is involved in the corruption network. And the mechanisms that generate and reproduce this kind of trust are different in the case of organized crime. I would add only one point. There can be, and we can observe corruption also within criminal organization. That's a very specific case. When there is a breach of trust, a betrayal of trust of one member of a criminal group who betray others in order to get a private advantage, a material advantage. And that's the case of corruption within the criminal groups, a paradoxical case in which corruption, private corruption within the criminal organization might be beneficial to the public because it weakens the criminal organization. That's the case of those who cooperate with justice, those who snitch, and so on.
Jay, your thoughts, please, on that? I think this is such an interesting question. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, it is simply because there's, to me, in any criminal conspiracy, criminal association, any crime that involves two or more people, trust is crucial. So it's not just organized crime, it is all of corruption, because you're relying on the other party to help you carry out an illicit scheme. So trust is, to me, it's sort of, it's the bedrock of all this. And this is why even in that corporate case, the map that I showed, even in that case, the government got emails of the corporation between the corporate official and these middlemen. And the corporations basically say, now this money cannot come from me. And when you meet with the person, you cannot tell them, that you know me. I mean, this is how corruption works. This is it. And the middle person was a facilitator, as Alberto says, an enabler. But all organized groups have these people, because if you have an organized crime group who deals in just drugs, let's say, if you're an ongoing criminal enterprise, which all organized crime groups are, well, you need to be able to corrupt, whether it's local police or the judiciary or politicians. So you need that person who has the face to the outside world. So trust is crucial. Sometimes you have to buy that trust. Sometimes you have to threaten. But this to me is why things such as protections for whistleblowers and insiders to come forward are very, very crucial, because the beginnings of many corruption cases come from people who know what's going on the inside, coming out and telling about it. But if they're unprotected, you will find many fewer cases.
And I think this speaks to the question that Claudia has put in the chat. Claudia, do you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for this panel and this conversation. It's absolutely fantastic. And I love this opportunity to ask this question to the panelists, which is a question that has been haunting me for a long time as a Mexican, because the question is about contexts where it's really difficult to figure out who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So in Mexico, of course, we have drug cartels as a major organized crime problem. And we know that they are very good at corrupting left and right and ensuring impunity and so on. But we also have a government that is very corrupt, and especially a judiciary system that is very corrupt. We have lots of stories and instances where law enforcement is instrumentalized for political purposes. So the kind of a scenario that I'm talking about is when we have a new government coming in and there's a high level, very publicized arrest of, say, a high level military person who has been found to have been taking bribes from the drug cartel. This person is arrested, maybe even convicted, and then after some time is let go. And then the accusations start flying one way and the other, because of course, this is a corrupt government that, everybody gets away with impunity. But then other people say, well, this was actually the good guy in the military who was playing, trying to blow the whistle, and all the other corrupt military colluded to have him, arrested and convicted. So we have this kind of carousel, if you want, of high-level people getting arrested and then let go, and accusations coming and going about instrumentalization of the law enforcement system. And we also have a clear situation where corruption is weaponized for political purposes. So as a citizen, you are left completely dumbfolded. And I find it really difficult, even me being a political scientist, this is a question that I've been pondering for a long time. And I was wondering if the panel of experts, being experts on corruption and organized crime, have given any thought on how analytically one can tackle this kind of situation to try to unravel and find perhaps entry points for anti-corruption. Thank you.
Shall I?
Yeah, please.
Going in the usual order. Yeah. Wow, that is a really, really difficult question. First up, I'm going to throw in a couple of examples where I think I've seen change from systemic corruption situations. And one is a case study that I've been researching recently about medicines procurement in Ukraine. Was completely captured by a few essentially organized crime groups who were taking winning the contracts from cronies in the Ministry of Health, inflating prices, not providing enough drugs. What happened is, firstly, there was a revolution in Ukraine. So, if the answer starts with "you need a revolution," I know that's not particularly comforting. But it's that situation where you've got a new government coming in, but then also a really effective building of a coalition of interested parties who were interested in change. So you had patients groups who were not getting their medicines. You had some companies who were not winning contracts but should have been, and you had some technocrat government reformers who were able to come in and take the positions in the Ministry of Health. And they really effectively formed a coalition. And then what they did is they asked external agents to come along and run the procurement process. So they essentially took that piece of government out of this corrupt system for a few years. They got these external agents to come in and run it. And what that did is, so they were, reputable agents who had experience of running procurement systems, and that immediately sent a signal to suppliers that the system is going to be open now. So normally they had a problem that, the good pharma companies, as it were, wouldn't even bother bidding because there was no point, because you knew it was all corrupt. Once you've got this very clear signal that you've got an external agent doing the procurement process and it's going to be fair, and also you're going to get paid because you've got the people on the government side too, then it was possible to get other suppliers to come and bid. And then you manage to get this change, and you build up support for that, also because you're then getting drugs to patients, and the people are pleased that the state tax money is not being so much stolen. So I think, the combination of window of opportunity plus a quite effective coalition with many different actors worked there. And then just briefly in Jamaica too, similar situation in a way, though, so big case around about 2010 where there was, big organised crime clampdown, and then a lot of investment in some new anti-corruption agencies and organised crime agencies, and again, which almost essentially set up as parallel institutions next to the police organisations, which were seen as quite corrupted. These new organisations were built up, a bit of technical assistance from abroad, a bit of recruiting in new people who were fresh out of college, and they could get them before they were socialised into the system. And those agencies now seen as, quite effective against this really entrenched systemic corruption and organised crime. So I don't know, it's really difficult, not at all a magic bullet, but I think there's something there around being able to create something a bit new, bring a lot of technical capacity in, and then the signal that sends to other actors that things are different.
Alberto or Jay, did you want to come in on that point?
Just briefly. Well, that's a tough question indeed. I have no answer, I have to admit. Analytically, it could be described as a situation in which this intertwining between systemic corruption close to kleptocracy, I would say, and very powerful criminal organization, mafia-like, so to say. And so they create a lot of vicious circles, which of course negatively affect the quality of democracy. So the recruitment in the public administration and within the judiciary. So it's very difficult to find some kind of entry point. And I agree with Liz, there is no silver bullet to fight it. What I can say that probably on a smaller scale, we had something similar in certain regions of Italy, where we haven't found any solution yet, but probably the situation has improved in the last decades. And well, what we observed here is the combination of, so to say, a top-down strategy and bottom-up strategy against this kind of situation. So some kind of popular support is necessary, for instance, to an outsider, a political leader who can credibly represent an anti-corruption, a strong anti-corruption stance, for instance. But also in the judiciary, that's the case of, there is, for decades, there was some kind of a collusion. So the judiciary didn't recognize the existence of Cosa Nostra, of 'Ndrangheta. So at a certain point within the judiciary, the new recruitment of judges generated a new generation of judges who were able to recognize and fight effectively mafia. Unfortunately, some of them were murdered, but they gave a symbolic value to the fight against the mafia that induced a lot of other young students of law to recruit themselves within the judiciary to fight against mafia. So that's it. I think you have to try to start these virtuous cycles, being lucky enough to find the right person at the right moment in the right role, at the political or at the judicial level.
Jay, I saw you unmute yourself a couple of times.
Oh my God, yeah. Just two things. I'm a big believer that most lasting change comes from the bottom up and not from the top down. The question that was asked is great. Please look at the websites of the World Bank, OECD, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. All of them have been doing great, ground level work on trying to take corruption out of procurement procedures and all kinds of things. The UNODC has been doing a lot of work on judicial integrity, which is a problem in a number of countries, through model laws, through trainings around the world, all kinds of things. So there is things happening. But I do want to say that the role of civil society is crucial. Alberto mentioned this, but good quality investigative journalism, civil society activism, external oversight, this is what's needed, because you can't let people who want to ignore corruption always win the day. In many of the biggest cases from the Panama Papers on up and down came as a result of civil society efforts, investigative journalism efforts. These are extremely important to continually remind people that these problems exist, they're ongoing, so people in power who are benefiting from the existing situation can't ignore them. I think that's very important.
What a brilliant way to end as well, as we are all members of civil society after all too, and perhaps that's the role that we've discussed least here. But thank you all so much for joining us. This has been a brilliant webinar. I have learned so much personally. Thank you to Liz, Alberto, to Jay, and to everyone for their questions too. As I said, this is one of a series of 3, so please do look up the other events that are going on. I had one question up my sleeve about new data sources and methods, so I will make sure to come to the next event and post that to the subjects in the future. But thank you all, and yeah, please do stay in touch. Have a lovely evening, stay safe.